Stranger Things is over. For a lot of people, it was their childhood, their pandemic show, their comfort watch. So, naturally, now that it's ended, the reaction is massive, and calling it polarizing would be an understatement. But a split reaction isn't unique to Stranger Things, it happens to almost every long running show. Finale discourse gets so strange that I usually avoid it entirely for a while. People argue vibes and personal attachments and whether their favorite character got what they wanted, which is understandable, but not very useful from a writer's perspective. Watching people either love the Stranger Things finale or hate it with an almost impressive level of passion made me think. Maybe the real question isn't whether the finale was good or bad. Maybe the better question is, what does a good finale even mean? So, in this video, I want to break down why finales are almost always disappointing and why they are brutal to write, both structurally and emotionally. Spoiler warning, obviously, and yes, this is a long one, so grab some tea. Because before we can talk about whether a specific ending works, we need a framework. Sure, some finales are good just because the story has ended. But a well-written finale always does a few very specific things. Think of this as the ingredients of a strong finale. And the first ingredient is thematic closure. It answers the question, what was the story really about? An ending can be open. It can leave mysteries unresolved. In some stories, answering everything would actually make the ending worse. But a finale still has to answer the thematic question. The idea the story has been circling from the start. At its core, Stranger Things is a story about growing up. Season 1 starts with kids whose world is small and structured around games, routines, and imagination. The upside down is childhood fear made physical. It's the monster under the bed, the thing you don't understand but know is there. As the series goes on, the kids grow up and the threats change with them. The danger becomes more personal and psychological, more tied to identity and trauma. As Dustin says in his valedictorian speech, their childhood was stolen. Eleven's arc is built around that idea, and throughout the show we see this theme again and again. Kids desperately trying to have a normal childhood. By the finale, the show is no longer asking whether childhood can be protected. It really can. The question now is whether it can be left behind, and thematically the finale answers that question. A final D&D campaign mirroring the first episode makes it clear that the story loop is closing. Mike and the others closing the basement and walking out literally and symbolically shows them leaving their childhood rituals behind. Those rituals are then inherited by the next generation of Hawking kids. The final moments of the show linger on separation, on future paths, and the realization that this chapter is over. If the first theme is about leaving childhood behind, the second is about what replaces it. When the safety of childhood disappears, the show asks a different question. What keeps you alive after that? The answer is connection. People defeat evil together through trust, coordination, and care. Every time characters are isolated, they become vulnerable, and every time they reconnect, they're able to fight back. Even Eleven's powers only work because of emotional grounding. The show also argues that if you're open-minded and willing to connect, you can find family in unexpected places. Friends Don't Lie is more than just a rule that Eleven learns from the game. It's a thematic statement about how belonging works in this story. Lying, keeping secrets, even white lies meant to protect someone consistently make things worse. And so does lying to yourself. Every time characters avoid the truth, it fractures the group and makes them weaker. Henry suppresses his most traumatic memories, and it turns him into something monstrous. Will hides his identity and suffers in silence. Nancy and Jonathan eventually realize that holding on to what they used to be only creates distance. But by the finale, nearly all the secrets are finally out in the open. The group is emotionally whole, and only then can the final fight even happen. And then no single character wins. The victory belongs to the group. That is thematic closure. And all of this leads us to the show's most complicated theme evil. Stranger Things borrows heavily from Stephen King's universe, which, no surprise given the homage. In King's stories, evil has two sides a cosmic metaphorical evil like monsters and unnatural forces, and a mundane human evil like bullies, abusive parents, or cruel authorities. And often these forces aren't separate, they converge into one consuming destructive power. People are used, corrupted, and possessed by it. It's a universe where evil is both outside you and inside you, and the stakes feel enormous because of that duality. Stranger Things adopts a similar approach. It shows us monsters, cruel scientists, even Russians. Evil isn't just one thing, it's layered and multifaceted. The show even leans into the idea of a hive mind, of evil as a systemic force that spreads through people and places. The problem is, in the finale, that thematic weight of evil doesn't feel as prominent. Vecna had the potential to be an iconic, morally resonant villain. There is a moment when Will confronts him, and for a second it seems like maybe the Mind Flayer has been pulling strings all along and Henry's a good guy. So you're bracing for disappointment, maybe some muddled redemption arc for Henry, but no. Vecna confirms that this was all deliberate. He chose evil. Eleven becomes a thematic counter argument. She came from the same suffering, but she chooses connection over domination. I love this. But once that moral choice is established, the story undermines the stakes. Vecna is defeated very easily. The build up promised us the ultimate mastermind manipulative, brilliant, capable of exploiting everyone's darkest secrets and traumas. Yet, by the finale, none of that fully lands. The Mind Flayer, which had previously been terrifying, suddenly just lets them go. And two characters died, or presumably died in this season, but neither of them because of Vecna. In previous seasons, there were real sacrifices made to defeat monsters and save the town and even the world. I admit the show has always been fairly safe. Characters who died heroically were usually new arrivals, clearly marked for sacrifice from the start, but this season was the safest yet. Nothing is inherently wrong with that, but the stakes fell incredibly low when it's obvious that all the core characters are effectively protected from the big bad. So, thematically, the finale succeeds, but emotionally and narratively, the plot resolution underwhelms. The story pushes quickly past the central mystery to focus on farewells and emotional closure, and that I think is why the finale divides people. Next ingredient is character arc completion. If thematic closure answers what the story was about, character arc completion answers who the story was about. A good finale doesn't need to make everyone happy, but it does need to make every major character land somewhere that feels earned. Like Fleabag. She doesn't end up with the man and doesn't fix her past. What she gains is self awareness, the ability to stop performing and to finally face herself without irony as armor. That's arc completion. In Better Call Saul, the finale strips Jimmy down to the core of who he is a man who finally chooses honesty over performance. Whether you find it ending satisfying or devastating, it is absolutely earned. You can trace every step backward. So let's look at Stranger Things. Which arcs actually close and which ones just kind of wander off camera? I'll start with Will, and I'll be honest, I don't love how his arc ends. Will's emotional journey is acknowledged, but not really resolved. The episode before the finale put heavy focus on his insecurities, his identity, his coming out, and that makes sense. This is an inner conflict that's been with him since season 1. This felt important, like something the finale had to answer. But did it lead anywhere? Not really. In the finale, Will helps Eleven defeat Vecna and says he's no longer afraid of him. And emotionally, that works. Will has lived in fear for years of monsters, of rejection, of himself. The problem here is again structural. Will has already done this before. He's already resisted Vecna and saved people through his willpower. So this moment doesn't feel like a new transformation for him. I still love this character and I like how he's handled across the series. And sure, it's nice to know he finds happiness in the future. But as a final bit, it was pretty weak. Joyce was the first character to fight the evil threatening her family, and she gets to deliver the final blow. So her story comes full circle from frantic, disbelieved mother to decisive world saving force. Now, Hopper. I think Hopper's arc is completed beautifully. He loses a daughter again, but this time he doesn't shut down, he doesn't push people away. He allows himself to love, to be loved, and to stay open even when it hurts. Nancy, Jonathan, Robin, and Steve are handled well too. Their arcs are about finding their place in the world and stepping into adulthood. The childish love triangles, school hierarchies, and popularity contests are in the past. There's a touch of sweet nostalgia as they promise to meet up now and then, and we, the audience, know they probably won't because that's just how adult life works. The kids' journeys are wrapped up nicely too, mostly by showing their future paths. Not everyone stays together, not everyone wants the same thing anymore, and that's okay. The story lets them grow without pretending growing up is painless. Now, Eleven's arc is complicated, and not in a good way. More in a why are we doing this way? Her self destructive sacrifice doesn't really work for me thematically or structurally. I might be missing something, but I don't see how it progresses her arc, especially considering how much narrative machinery is dragged in to justify it. We get this bulky military subplot, the pregnancy experiments, the new Henry's lore, all seemingly designed just to push Eleven toward a stage death. Or a real one, or an ambiguous one, pick your poison. My problem with this is it doesn't feel like growth. It's not a sacrifice to save her found family. It's not a conscious culmination of her journey. If anything, it feels like a bad idea encouraged by Kali, a character associated with rage and self destruction, while Hopper, who represents care and grounding, actively argues against it. So I kept waiting for some realization. Maybe Vecna tries to use this death wish against her and she rejects it, or maybe she does sacrifice herself, but in a way that feels like a choice she's grown into. Instead, the plot just barrels forward. The entire storyline feels rushed, thematically hollow, and disconnected from the emotional work Eleven has already done in previous seasons. I'd argue it cancels some of her growth. I like the ambiguity of whether she survives, that part's interesting, but the road there, I didn't buy it and I didn't like it. So, some character arcs are resolved with care and intention. Others feel undercooked, especially when core characters are sidelined while the story spends time on minor ones like Holly or Vicky. Next ingredient is foreshadowing and build up. This ingredient answers one question: was the ending earned? At first, I didn't want to talk about pacing or the attention given to different plots and characters. I wanted to keep this video strictly about finales, but I changed my mind. The last season of Stranger Things has so much going on that you just can't evaluate the finale without looking at the road that led to it. This finale lives inside years of build up. Remember how bad Game of Thrones felt in the end? It was because the ending inherited years of rushed character logic and unresolved build up. Now think about Dark. Love it or hate it, but its ending is earned because the show spends 3 seasons teaching you its rules and its themes. Every scene and every symbol is a hint about how the world works. So when the finale comes, you realize the story has actually been training you for this question about determinism, cycles, and sacrifice. That's payoff. So, how does Stranger Things measure up? The show has always leaned into escalation. Every season introduces a bigger monster, a deeper mystery, and a wider cast. In the final season, there are a lot of threads that never truly felt like they were set up properly. Multiple new subplots like the military experiment plot, side characters who are introduced and given big moments, but escalation isn't the same as narrative payoff. The narrative compresses multiple climactic threads into a short sequence. The final confrontation with Vecna and the Mind Flare is resolved quickly, leaving little time to feel the weight of the threat. The result is a finale that delivers emotional closure and thematic resolution but lacks structural payoff. The ending is earned in moments of nostalgia, friendship, and symbolic closure of childhood, but it struggles to reconcile the build-up of threads, subplots, and character growth in a fully satisfying way. And that leads us to the last ingredient of the good finale: emotional catharsis. A good finale makes the audience feel the story stakes, the cost of the journey, and the weight of the ending. One of the most powerful emotional bits of the finale is its emphasis on final moments together. It evokes nostalgia and the recognition that childhood and this chapter of life is truly over. That kind of catharsis is universal. Everyone understands the sting of living something that shaped them. Many of the emotionally resonant beats aren't tied to defeating monsters but to relationships, like Dustin honoring Eddie or the quiet acknowledgement shared between Hopper and Mike. These moments complete emotional threads that have existed across seasons, like loyalty, family, love, and forgiveness. Eleven's fate, of course, also creates a powerful emotional moment. I loved it because the uncertainty around it works almost like real life. Real endings rarely give us perfect certainty. But one of the most vivid emotional outcomes of this finale is how it functions as a mirror for the audience's own life experiences. After nearly a decade with these characters, through adolescence, personal changes, and global upheaval, saying goodbye becomes a personal transition for the audience as well. But emotional payoff tied to spectacle and rushed confrontations doesn't land as effectively. So, all that said, was the ending of Stranger Things good or bad? I'd say it wasn't my favorite television ending, and it wasn't even my favorite ending of a Stranger Things season. But it definitely acknowledges its audience and its themes. Some of the creative choices just weren't strong. The truth is, finales are brutally difficult to write, especially for long, sprawling stories like this. Many stories are structured with a clear starting point and ending point, and the challenge is filling in everything in between in a meaningful way, creating a coherent journey. Stranger Things wasn't built that way. It's a story that develops organically as new seasons are added. I don't think this approach is inherently wrong. It's just how serialized television often works, but it makes a strong, satisfying finale much harder to pull off. And in the end, many of the wicked choices the story made fall into the same common traps that endings often do. One of the most common traps finales fall into is introducing too many new subplots, characters, or twists right before the end. And it's an easy trap to fall into. Sometimes writers want to save their biggest ideas for the finale. Sometimes they simply don't know how to end the story, so they keep adding momentum instead of resolution. The problem is, it becomes a vicious cycle. You introduce a new plot device to resolve an old one, which creates new questions, which now also need resolving or get dropped entirely. The way out of this trap is subtraction, not escalation. You define what actually matters and then commit to that. Another trap is over-explanation. The impulse to answer everything and reassure the audience that nothing was missed is also understandable, but it weakens the ending. One of my favorite endings is Whiplash. We don't know what happens to Andrew. We don't know if he becomes famous, if he is happy, or if he destroys himself. All we get is that final nod from Fletcher, and anything more would only weaken it. The opposite trap is refusing to explain anything at all. When a story builds complex mythology and then sidesteps it with some symbolic or abstract ending, It always feels like the narrative itself gave up. Lost is a classic example. Years of layered mysteries ultimately resolved through a vague spiritual conclusion that didn't meaningfully engage with the show's own questions. And before the Stranger Things finale aired, there was a popular theory that the entire show would turn out to be just a D&D game. That would have been a disaster. Thankfully, that trap was avoided. Another major pitfall is ignoring foreshadowing. If a finale contradicts the story's internal logic or resolves conflicts in ways that weren't properly built up, it feels arbitrary instead of inevitable. The obvious example here is Daenerys' descent into madness, which could have worked. The idea isn't the problem. The problem is that the groundwork wasn't there. Stranger Things doesn't quite do that, but it stumbles in the opposite direction. The show invests heavily in foreshadowing, especially with characters like Vecna, Eleven, and Will, and then never truly delivers on that promise. And finally, there is the trap of playing it too safe. These are characters we've lived with for years. Of course, there is an instinct to protect them, but safety comes at a cost. The episode often flirts with danger, like Steve nearly falling, Nancy acting as bait, but those moments only deepen the sense that it's all a game, because we already know the core characters are untouchable. I've seen the argument that Stranger Things is a wholesome show. It's about friendship. The kids are a big part of the audience, so killing core characters would betray the tone. It has to be like a fairy tale where no one truly dies. But there is another story about friendship, one that too was cozy and formative and beloved by kids. Yeah, I'm talking about Harry Potter. That story also protected its core cast, but it still sacrificed beloved characters and it didn't kill the tone. And honestly, Stranger Things is already dealing with far more adult themes and it carries rating to match. So at that point, avoiding irreversible choices only lowers the stakes. Is it possible to write a good finale? Yes. Is it possible to write one that satisfies everyone? Not even close. But one thing I want to know is this. Not all endings feel disappointing because they are badly written. Sometimes they hurt because they are endings. When a show ends, so does the ritual, the waiting, the theorizing, the sense that something is still ahead. Finales carry the impossible task of providing closure while also asking us to let go. And letting go always feels bad, even when it's done well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.